Hi, I'm Tony Northrop for Train Signal, and in this video lesson for the SSCP certification exam, I'm going to cover the incident handling analysis process. This is what you do when somebody breaks into your network, so it's really an important lesson. Oh my God, a compromise occurred, and sometimes the scariest part is that somebody already knows. Compromises happen all the time and we simply aren't aware of them. So often it's a good thing that you discovered the compromise. Another name for the incident handling process is incident management. There's not a standard process for it. There's not some open ISC or ISO. No organization has created a defined list of steps for this, but here are 4 common steps, and every incident handling process I've seen follows basically the same process. I'm going to go into each of these steps in more detail later, but up first is identify and report. And by the time you start this process, the identify part of that has already occurred. Somebody's figured out there's a compromise. That's why the process started. And then you're on to reporting, which is writing down all the information you can from the first responder and maybe starting the investigate process, where you diagnose the problem and you scan the networks and you learn as much about the attack as you possibly can. Once you figure out what happened, when it started, who did it, etc., then you start to recover from it. Maybe you restore things from backups, or you install some new patches to prevent it happening again. And as part of that process, you test it to make sure it's really fixed. And finally, it's the debrief phase. Sometimes they call this post-mortem. And here you break down what happened, what went wrong, how can you prevent it from happening in the future, and how did the incident handling process itself go. The highest priorities of the incident handling process are damage and loss control. You're trying to minimize your losses due to this incident, and sometimes that's making sure that the people who did it are reported to law enforcement. Sometimes it's just getting the servers back up and running as fast as possible if they were taken offline by a denial of service attack. You also need to identify the scope of the incident. How many systems were affected and what parts of the systems were infected? How long ago did they get infected, so that you can restore it from a clean backup? As part of the process, you usually also disconnect the affected systems from the network while trying to keep critical business functions available. Sometimes both those things aren't possible. Sometimes you have to decide to leave a possibly infected server up and running because the functions that it's providing that are still working are too important. Sometimes you decide it's more important to pull it from the network, and you're going to have users screaming because they can't get to their systems. This is all part of the incident handling process. All right, so now let's dig into the first step, which is identify and report. So let's talk about how a compromise is identified. The best case scenario is that your automated monitoring system detects it. This is like Tom Cruise tripping that laser tripwire in Mission Impossible. That you have some automated system that actually happens to detect the alert. This can happen. Maybe there's a new account created on a system that wasn't supposed to be there. Maybe a honeypot gets attacked from one of your internal systems. The worst case scenario is that a customer calls in and says, I think something's wrong. This can definitely happen. I worked at web hosting organizations for years, and customer systems would get hacked, and they'd call us and they'd say, weren't you supposed to be protecting our systems? And we'd say, sorry, it happens. And that's when the incident handling process starts. Another way that often happens is an employee will simply detect something. If a website's been defaced, that's really obvious, and hacking groups will do that. They'll put up their logos and brag about how they hacked you and they're super elite and stuff. That's employee detection. It happens in other ways too. Sometimes somebody will be using your server to host files on the internet, usually something illicit, and they'll just fill up the drive because they're good hackers but not good systems administrators, I guess, and they can't manage their storage. And then you'll get like a drive full alert, and you'll go in and you'll check it out, and you'll be like, I'll probably just need to empty the recycle bin, and then you'll say, oh my God, there's illicit files here. Somebody's compromised this system. Different ways that attacks are detected. At this point, you start to gather information about the compromise. You make sure that it really is a compromise, and sometimes that's obvious. But if there's a new stray account on a system, it could just be an account that an internal employee set up to test something. Or maybe they had a contractor and the employee needed to make an account for him, but it didn't follow the proper procedure. So it's not a proper compromise, it's just a false alarm. Once you identify that it is a compromise, you need to create a separate, internal, confidential, private ticket to track this. And I can't stress this enough because you don't want to make security tickets public. You don't want everybody in your IT support department to see this ticket. There are a few different reasons for this. For one, during the investigation process, you're hopefully going to identify the vulnerability that was used to compromise your system, and you don't want other people to know about known vulnerabilities and ways to exploit them. They could whisper something to a friend, or they could use it for their own gain, so you want as few to know about that as possible. It could also damage your organization's reputation. Look, I understand that security compromises are happening 24/7, 365, happens all the time. We do our best to prevent them, but nobody's perfect. Everybody else doesn't understand that. If there's a security compromise at your credit card company, which happens all the time, I guarantee it, and you saw it in the news, you might be a little freaked out. You might pull your credit card from that company and move it over to another company, even though that company might have just as many security compromises. So it's really important that you create a separate confidential ticket and allow access to it on a need-to-know basis only. That ticket has to have change control. Everybody who updates any part of it needs to have that tracked. Most organizations have a ticketing system that has change control built into it, so anytime somebody changes a single byte in the whole ticket, that change and the state before and after is tracked. The reason for this is, imagine that it's an internal employee who broke into the systems and they see a new ticket opened up tracking this compromise. Well, they could go in and just change some stuff so that it didn't look sneaky at all, so that it looked like a false alarm. Or they could change it to cover their tracks, change IP addresses from the log files. If you have that change control system, well, they can still go in and change it, but you'll know that they changed it, and that's actually more evidence against them. You need to make sure that you capture all communications in this ticket, and much of this is true for any type of support ticket, but it's especially true for security tickets. So if somebody instant messages you, you need to paste that instant message into the ticket. If somebody calls you, you need to do your best to transcribe that call into the ticket. It doesn't need to be word for word usually, though some systems will record the call itself. But you need to capture as much as possible, do it in a timely manner so that you know what time this information came in, and capture who said it. You need to use this ticket for all the information that you gathered during the investigation. It's important that it be in one place so that somebody in the future can look at it and get a quick picture of everything that happened and how the investigation unfolded. Now, frequently in a security compromise, you need to communicate with outside customers. You want to do this with a separate ticket. This is a lesson I learned the hard way. I know I have a whole slide where I'm pushing this, but it's because I felt some pain about this. In my organization, we had many security compromises, because everybody does. But one of the first ones, a customer called in to open the ticket and complain about a security compromise, and we just used that public ticket that the customer could see to track our investigation. And as the investigators started finding different vulnerabilities in our network, they would list it in the ticket. And the customer could see this. So the customer was like, oh my God, what are you guys doing? There's like 100 vulnerabilities. You guys are really sloppy, and it really tarnished our reputation. The customer wasn't happy with us at all. They didn't need to see all of that. They didn't need to see the internal bickering and the finger pointing that started. The right way to handle that is to do the finger pointing and the bickering in an internal ticket, and then create a nice external ticket that summarizes everything, packages it up, explains, apologizes, but doesn't provide all that extra detail because customers don't need it, and it just makes you look bad. On to step 2, the investigation process. This is really cool because it's almost like police work, it's like detective work. Now, your priorities. Every time I list priorities in security, the first one is always going to be human safety. Human life in general is always the top priority. So this is important to understand because not all security compromises are IT-based. If somebody physically breaks into your building, well, that could be a threat to human safety. Maybe they're just a burglar who just wants to steal a server so they can pawn it. Or maybe they're a kidnapper, or maybe they are just a burglar who happens to carry a weapon. Obviously, you would need to make your priorities removing the potential victims and getting the intruder in a safe place. That might mean not sending your security guard in there, but instead waiting for the police to come. After human safety, your next priority is to record everything. I was talking about this already, but it's really important for forensics and evidence that you capture every little bit of detail that you can. You can't have too much information. It's easier to skim over it later and disregard stuff or remove it from the summary of the record than it is to go back and capture detail that you're unsure about. With IT systems, you want to prevent the compromise from spreading further. So the way you do that is by isolating the system. If your web server gets hacked, usually one of the first things you want to do is move it to a private network where the attacker can't use that computer as a jumping off point to get to other parts of your network. You also often want to isolate the hard drive itself. Removing the hard drive from the computer allows you to capture the current state. For example, it's common for more sophisticated attackers to use software that can detect whether it's been detected. If the attacker detects that its identity has been compromised, it can start to erase itself. For example, it could completely format the drive, removing all traces of it. So the way you prevent that from happening is you pull the plug. You unplug the computer, you pull out the hard drive, and you don't start it up again. So often, investigators make the mistake of grabbing the infected computer and putting it on their desk and firing it up because they want to go and poke around in the log files, and that's what we normally do, right? Well, most of the time that won't cause any problem, but if you have a sophisticated attacker, what'll happen is it will detect that you're investigating it and it's out of there. Criminals do this. If you gather their laptop for evidence, there are systems where if you don't type the special password or do some secret sequence, sometimes it's a hidden sequence that isn't prompted for, moving the mouse in a particular pattern or pressing some keys away from the password prompt. Well, these are things that are not obvious, but they indicate to software running on the computer that the user is genuine. So law enforcement comes along and they power up that laptop and maybe they even know the guy's password and they go and type it in the password prompt, but they don't do the secret sequence. Well, the computer just starts to erase everything. It just melts itself maybe. And then you've lost your evidence. So if you isolate the hard drive doesn't have the capability to run a process or delete itself unless it's been specially modified. And yes, there are systems that can do that. But it's better safe than sorry, because if you leave it attached to the original computer, that's a distinct possibility. Now, if you were to try to do your investigations with the computer running, you'd be making changes to the computer whether you knew it or not. You'd be adding events to the event log. You'd be modifying little system files and temporary files, and all these changes are distractions from what the attacker might have done. They make it more difficult to isolate changes related to the attack from changes related to the investigation. And that's another reason why you want to grab that hard drive out of the computer and isolate it before you start doing anything else. Since you know the computer is compromised, you don't want to go in there and log in with your username and password, right? It could have some key logging software on it, and you could make the situation worse. And this happens. It really does. And it's happened to my own organization, not with my credentials, but with other users' credentials. We'd had a server hacked, and of course the domain admin went in there like, I'm going to investigate this and find the attacker and clean stuff up. But he typed his password in, and the software promptly shipped off his username and password to some bad guy, and that bad guy used that guy's domain admin credentials to do bad stuff on our whole network. So this is a risk. The investigation process can actually make the compromise worse. And it's not beyond imagination that an attacker could set up an unsophisticated attack as a trap to get the first responders in there and collect information from them and use that additional information to leverage a far more significant attack. One of your priorities during the investigation is to identify the time of the first compromise. And here's why that's important. Because you want to be able to roll the systems back to a time before they were compromised. Because from the moment of compromise forward, you can't trust the system anymore. Because you could never truly identify every little thing that the attacker did. How many different accounts that they made, how many system files that they might have replaced, drivers that they might have swapped out, how many backdoors that they put in. So in the end, if you really want to be sure about getting your system clean, you're going to have to restore it from a backup made before the compromise. So it helps to know when that time was. And of course, you want to identify the vulnerability that was used to compromise the computer. We talked about vulnerabilities in other lessons, so I won't go into a lot of detail there. Okay, so I know I just talked on and on about how you don't want to analyze a running system, but often what will happen is you'll discover the system is compromised while you're connected to it. And if that's the case, well, you've already authenticated, so any damage that's done is done, right? And there is information that you can gather from the running system that you can't simply pull from the hard drive, and that's the current state of memory, as well as active network connection. So I just wanted to quickly go over networking tools that you can use to collect information. And I don't see any way that the SSCP certification exam is going to test your knowledge of the specific details of this. But again, I want you to know this for the real world. So the way I always collect all the incoming network connections in a Windows computer is to use the netstat tool. So you'll see there I put all the parameters -n, -b, -o. That basically shows any active connections, and it will show the IP address that they're connecting to. The IP address, of course, doesn't tell you too much about where it's coming from, but you can look up IP addresses and figure out what country they're in and such later after you've recorded it. The angle bracket there to textfile.txt, which I recommend saving to a flash drive because you don't trust that computer anymore. That just saves it to a text file so you can analyze all that information later on. Because you don't want to be doing it on the computer, save it to a text file and then take it back to a trusted system, and you can investigate the meaning behind all those different connections. It can help you identify an attacker. You know, it's common for people who compromise computers to go through multiple different systems before they actually get to the system that they want to use. But it's a start at least. It might just tell you the next system that they're connected to. But if you continue to track it back, eventually you'll find the attacker. Another tool that I like to use is Process Explorer. That's a sysinternals tool, and it's for Windows systems, but there are equivalents to all of these for every operating system out there. Process Explorer just lists all the different processes on the computer and the resources that each is accessing. And a protocol analyzer, that's not a name of a tool, but it's a sniffer. I've covered this in other lessons. It's something that records and analyzes network communication. So if you have access to the system and it's running, fire up a protocol analyzer and just start capturing network traffic. This can give you really useful clues about who's currently connecting to the system and what types of things that they're doing on it. Another tool from sysinternals is called LiveKD. And what that does is it just dumps the memory of the computer to a file. Another way to do that is to simply put the computer into hibernation mode if it supports that. This takes the entire state of the memory and writes it to the hard disk. So then later when you pull out the hard disk, you can dig into that and see what was going on at the time you shut it down. There are also specialized forensics tools, which are really the ideal way to do this. One example is Live Marshal, but I'm not recommending that specifically. There are dozens of different tools out there. You usually keep them on a flash drive, you plug them into the computer, and they can just run, and they dump everything about what the computer is currently doing to a file as fast as possible. That way you can shut it down, just yank the power on it, stick the hard drive someplace safe, and analyze that data at your own convenience. So I want to drill this into your head. You can't trust anything on a compromised system. Rootkits can change the information that netstat shows, and they'll hide processes that are running from Process Explorer. That really happens. But I'll say in my experience, most attacks aren't that sophisticated. There'll be a process there called hacker. And you can see that it's writing a bunch of files to your disk and communicating with the guy's home IP address. Really, most attacks are really easy and simple to investigate. They're really straightforward. But there are attacks out there that are much more sophisticated. So I mentioned in the previous slide that you can capture your current memory state by putting it into hibernation mode. Hibernation mode is a power-saving feature. It allows the computer to resume all active applications at a later date after you've powered it down to save power. It's usually something that mobile computers support, but different server versions of Windows and other operating systems support it as well. Here we're not using it to save power, we're just using it to record the memory state. So if you have a computer and you want to capture as much as possible, but you don't have any access to forensics tools, just put it in hibernate mode. Then physically unplug the computer and disconnect the hard drives. You've done as much as you can to capture the system state. Now, connect those drives to another computer as non-bootable. You don't ever want to run a process from those untrusted drives again, because like I said, they could format themselves or erase the data or let the attacker know that you're onto them so they can physically flee. Instead, you're going to connect them as non-bootable data drives. Then you can dig into the files, you can look at the memory state that was saved in the Hibernation file, and maybe you can figure out some information about the attacker. Once I get those drives connected, what I usually do is I copy them to a virtual hard drive, and you can find different tools that will take a physical drive and clone it to a VHD drive. One of them is called Clone VHD, but there are a lot of different tools out there, and you shouldn't even have to pay for it. If, after you thoroughly investigate the VHD, you do want to boot it, well, first make a copy of it, and then connect it to a virtual machine. Virtual machines can boot cloned drives from VHDs pretty reliably. It's not perfect because, of course, the virtual environment has suddenly different hardware, but it usually works pretty well, and it will allow you to investigate any sort of malware that might be installed in there. If you have the right tools, you can even use the VHD to detect rootkits that are installed. Even in a VHD, you can't trust it. It is theoretically possible for virtual machines to compromise the host, so I suggest isolating the virtual machine from other computers, but also isolating the host computer from other computers on your network, because if malware goes from the virtual machine into the host, you don't know where it can travel from there. And again, you really want to keep these attacks quarantined because they will spread through your internal network even after they're discovered. So let's talk about chain of custody. And this is something that makes me lose my mind every time I watch any sort of crime drama where there's like police and investigations going on. Oh my God, the show Dexter drives me crazy. They have no respect for chain of custody whatsoever. Anyway, chain of custody maintains the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the evidence. You make sure you don't change anything, because if an investigator changes any part of the evidence, then you can't use it as evidence. Suddenly it's not evidence because you can't differentiate between what the investigator did or what the potential criminal might have done. And if the chain of custody has been broken and you actually end up going into the judicial system, the judge is going to toss it out. It's not evidence anymore. And that can mean that the attacker walks because you messed up something that you shouldn't have, because you decided to poke around on the computer a little bit because you installed some extra tools or did something else that's breaking the chain of custody. Every time you collect a piece of evidence, besides messing it up, you need to label it and put it somewhere safe. Document when you collected it, where you were, who collected it, and how each piece of evidence was collected. If it's physical evidence, you seal it in a tamper-evident bag with evidence tags on the outside. To review, the term tamper-proof would mean something was physically impossible for somebody to mess with. I'm not saying tamper-proof, I'm saying tamper-evident. That just means that you can tell if somebody messes with it, because that shows you that the chain of custody is broken. And therefore, if the bag is not tampered with, then you know the chain of custody hasn't been broken. So we're just assuring the judge that the chain of custody is intact. And of course, you need to protect that evidence as carefully as possible, because there are many cases, including the show Breaking Bad, which I take very seriously, where criminals have gone in and taken evidence out of evidence storage or damaged it in storage. And so you just need to keep it safe, because it could be that the criminal is actually inside your organization and following the investigation and aware of where the evidence is stored and such. So now I'll quickly go over basic forensic procedures. One of the most important elements is the order of volatility. Some of your evidence is going to have a short lifespan and you need to collect it first. This happens more in physical investigations than IT-based investigations, but imagine that you're investigating a break-in and there are footprints in the snow. Well, the order of volatility dictates that you capture as much about those footprints as possible right away, because that snow is going to melt and then you're not going to have that evidence anymore. It's also a good idea to make note of any time offset in the log files, because attacks often involve multiple different computers and they're each going to record the events in the event log according to their own system clock. Well, most of the time these are going to be synchronized in your organization automatically, but double check it, and if it's not, make a note of how far off it is. And finally, as I mentioned before, make a system image of everything. Going back to my favorite series, Breaking Bad, at some point they take into evidence the criminal's laptop, and the criminal wants to destroy this evidence. So he puts this huge magnet in a vehicle and parks it next to the building and uses that massive magnet to destroy the magnetic hard drive in the computer. And this is one of those cases where I'm just kind of shaking my head, because realistically, any organization who'd taken that computer into evidence, especially for an important case like that, they would have copied the hard drive and made a system image of it, and of course stored that image somewhere else on some big computer with a directory of other similar hard drives. And therefore, destroying the original hard drive wouldn't have changed the investigation whatsoever, except to kind of let the police know that there indeed might be something really valuable on there. Also, I didn't really believe it because I felt like the criminal was sophisticated enough that he certainly would have been using some sort of cryptography on the drive, which would have made it very difficult for the police investigators to access the data anyway. And also, he was a pretty rich guy, so I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that he would have had an SSD-based drive, one of these solid-state drives that are not magnetic and therefore wouldn't have been affected by the magnets. Anyway, it's a great show, but like I said, once you get this deep into security, you start to nitpick every crime show that you see. As I mentioned earlier, it's a great idea if you can capture some network traffic, maybe by using a protocol analyzer. If you have some system that's logging or monitoring network activity, it's a good idea to grab those log files too, because they might have important clues in them. Besides just looking at the tiny details of it, you can look for larger trends, such as spikes in network activity or changes in the location of the network communications. For example, the United States government recently accused China of hacking into both private and public organizations. If you were to suddenly see a spike in activity coming from Chinese-based computers, it might raise your eyebrow a little bit. You might be able to correlate those trends with the attack that you're investigating. It's also important to collect relevant backups. The backups capture the state of the system at previous times. You can use these backups to determine when malware got installed, but you can also see the types of activities that the attacker might have been doing on the computer over time. In other words, you could use the backups to go back to a particular date and then compare it to the next date and the next date and see how the attack evolved. During forensics, it's a good idea, of course, to take pictures of anything. You always see the police photographer at any crime scene in a TV show. I actually think it's a better idea to capture video, because video captures much more and you can always go back and look at individual still frames. So if you're ever concerned about overlooking a detail, capture video of everything. And worst case scenario, you can go back to that video and maybe find something that you overlooked. Here are some other assorted forensics tips. If you want to find out if files have changed, use a hashing tool. The most common hashing tools are based on the MD5 algorithm, though I really like the SHA-2 algorithm better because it has less collisions. I'll cover that in a different lesson. But a good way to use hashes is to get hashes of all the files on a computer that you know is clean. Then take hashes against a computer that you think is dirty or might have some infected files. Any files that show up with a different hash have changed somehow and therefore could be compromised. I'll say that it's important to do this with the hard drive offline. You don't want to be running the tests in an infected operating system. If you need to show that an application is doing something odd, often this happens with malware that pops up a message saying you need to pay some money to get the malware removed from your computer. That's extortion, by the way. You can capture a screenshot of it by pressing Alt and print screen on a Windows computer. This doesn't always work properly on an infected computer. They might try to stop you from doing this. You can always just use a digital camera. Just pull out your smartphone and snap a picture of the screen. It's better than nothing, right? Anybody that you have who has witnessed the infected system, somebody who's interacted with it, or the first responder, just interview them and record the interview if at all possible, because I'm sure you'll write down whatever information you can, but having that actual recording is not only useful as evidence, but it makes sure that you don't miss anything important. It's also important to keep track of the expense of the compromise. Later you can factor in how expensive it is for you to deal with a compromise when you're considering mitigating these risks. In other words, when you calculate the risk of a particular compromise, In the risk assessment process, well, you factor in how much it costs you when you lose an asset, but sometimes you don't factor in how much it costs you to deal with the compromise, and dealing with a compromise can be really expensive. So keep track of your man hours and expenses. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, be really careful about documenting everything to maintain the chain of custody. You don't necessarily know whether it's going to go to law enforcement or not, but if it does, it's really important to maintain that. The next stage is to resolve the problem. Try to get that system cleaned up and back up and running. And here are your priorities. Of course, the first priority is to notify law enforcement if that's applicable in the scenario. And the reason for that is law enforcement will step in and might make you take a different process. For example, they might need the computer as evidence. Therefore, you can't just pull the drives out and reformat it. You'll need to keep it intact. If during the investigation process you do anything that might destroy evidence, well, you need to call law enforcement before that. So you might even need to call law enforcement earlier in the process. Of course, you also need to notify stakeholders now that you know for sure there's been a compromise and you've kind of done some investigation into it. As we get the computer back up and running, well, you're going to need to patch vulnerabilities. If in the process of the investigation you identified that the vulnerability is something network-wide, maybe a firewall that didn't have the proper configuration, it's really important that you patch that right away so that other computers don't get infected with the same vulnerability. If the vulnerability was a missing patch, chances are good that other computers don't have that same patch. So audit and fix it. One of the most common things for any attacker to do after a successful compromise is to create new accounts for themselves. And a lot of people overlook this. They're going to try to create usually an administrator account for themselves that they can use as a backdoor in the future. And it's not going to have the username hacker. It might not be obvious at all. So you need to go through and make sure that there are no unaccounted for accounts. And if you work at an organization with 5 people, that can be pretty easy. If you work at an organization with tens of thousands of people, that can be pretty hard to do. It can be really hard to do. In fact, it's not even that easy at an organization with just 5 people, because when you look at the list of users on the computer, you'll see a bunch of user accounts you don't recognize, even when things are clean and intact, because the Windows system itself and other operating systems too, they make all these accounts for services and applications and network connectivity. And so what an attacker will do is they'll make an account that will seem to be one of these accounts. They'll call it system or network or server or something along those lines, and you might not easily be able to distinguish whether it's a genuine system account or an imposter account. And of course, once you've cleaned up all the traces of the attack, it's time to get stuff back up and running. That availability part of CIA, just be sure not to put a compromised system back online. So how do you get confidence back in your compromised system? Well, when looking at an individual computer, there are a couple of different processes you can use. There's a new technology, fairly new technology, called Secure Boot. Secure Boot is a feature of a lot of new computers that have UEFI firmware. That's the new update for BIOS. And what Secure Boot does is it just checks the checksum on the bootloader, and you can specify the exact bootloader that you want to use. So, for example, all new computers certified for use with Windows 8 have UEFI firmware, Secure Boot, and the required TPM chip, Trusted Platform Module. And they're configured by default to trust applications that have been signed by Microsoft. So they won't boot anything that hasn't been signed by Microsoft or another trusted provider, unless you've specifically marked another bootloader. Now, the nice thing about Secure Boot is an app cannot go in and trust a different bootloader by design. You have to manually go in with your fingers on the keyboard and set it up. This means that malware can't do it, which, at least in theory, right? And this allows you to recover a system that has Secure Boot with some level of confidence. You can just format the computer, reinstall your operating system, restore any data, but not any system files, patch the vulnerabilities, and connect it to the network. Now notice I didn't say format the computer and then restore the operating system from a backup. You can't restore your operating system or apps from a backup or anything executable unless you can be 100% sure that the backup you're restoring from didn't have the infection. And because it's so difficult to figure out exactly when your computer was first compromised, it's usually impossible. So you just end up creating a brand new, clean operating system image and reinstalling all your apps, and then just restoring the data files themselves. If your computer doesn't have secure boot, which a lot of computers created before, say, 2012 won't have, you pretty much have to replace the motherboard if you want to be completely confident. Now, I know a lot of people won't take this step. They'll just follow the same process of formatting and reinstalling and restoring from a backup. But you can never be completely sure because there are rootkits that infect the firmware of the computer and are undetectable. Even if you try to flash the firmware, they can hide in memory and reinstall themselves. You can reformat the drive, reinstall a new operating system, and you know what they're going to do? They're going to reinfect the drive so they can stay resident in the firmware. And the last I checked, there was no good way to be confident that you could get it out of the firmware because it can hide. What do? You pull the motherboard because that's where the firmware lives. And I know that's an expensive and time-consuming proposition, but if you want to be completely secure, that's what you got to do. A pain, right? You basically end up getting a new computer. Now, those are the processes that you need to follow if you want to be 100% confident that the compromise is not going to persist after the computer has been considered clean. In the real world, a lot of people take much lesser steps. You can simply check over the computer and run some anti-malware software, and then if you feel comfortable with it, just put it back online. If you feel confident that the attack was not sophisticated, if you just got some silly malware infection, well, you can probably run some anti-malware software, and once it says that it's clean, that might be good enough for you. You can't be completely clean. You don't know that it doesn't have malware that's simply evading the anti-malware software. Once a computer is compromised, the malware can do anything. It can hide from anti-malware. It can hide from just about anything. These bootkits are extremely sophisticated, so you really can't have complete confidence, but maybe you can have enough confidence. I know a lot of organizations don't want to put several days of work into rebuilding a computer to make sure it's clean, and they certainly don't want to buy new hardware to eliminate the risk of a firmware infection. So a lot of places do kind of use these half measures, which might be good enough. Remember that cloned image that you took of the drive, the VHD? You can restore files from that if you don't have them on a recent clean backup. But just be careful because even data files, the malware might have infected in some way. You don't know if it would have modified your data. Basically, you can no longer be confident about the integrity of anything that happened on that computer after the infection. But sometimes you don't need to be 100% confident. Sometimes you can just be like, oh, it's better than anything else I have since I don't have a good backup otherwise. And here we are at the last phase, the debriefing. Your top priority, of course, is finger pointing. Figure out who's at fault and make them feel stupid. No, don't do that. That will not get you anywhere. Everybody's going to feel like a silly goose anyway, because people take these security compromises extremely serious. Here's a story that I like to tell. I have a lot of friends in the security field, and when the younger guys are kind of coming up, they'll be kind of braggy, and they'll say things like, you know what, our organization has had no compromises. That's how good I am at security. And I always laugh and I say, you need to improve your monitoring systems. If you think you've had no compromises, then that means you're not catching the compromises. This happens in police investigations all the time. You'll be looking at crime records and suddenly there'll be a huge spike in crime in a town, and you might think, what's going on in this town? And then you look into it further and you realize they just hired some extra detectives. The rate of crime didn't change. They just started catching more criminals. In other words, the increase in crime rate is actually a good sign for the town. And the same thing happens in security. It's a good thing that you found the compromise, because I guarantee you these compromises are happening. And if you think they're not happening, then that means you're not looking closely enough. Your real first priority is to prevent the recurrence of this attack. You need to look at the vulnerability and make sure that it's patched. You also need to find a way to detect it if it does reoccur, because belt and suspenders, right? You can't focus entirely on prevention. You also need to update your monitoring system so that if it does occur again, you can catch it right away. Maybe that's detecting when a new account is created by an unauthorized user, or looking even for specific files. You could do signature matching to make sure if that a specific piece of malware gets installed, you know about it right away. You also need to take a look at the first 3 steps and identify any problems in how your team handled the incident. You can always be improving your own incident handling process and learning from your mistakes. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.